Welcome back. In this video, we'll be studying together the text of Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 to 2. As we said in our previous video, Daniel 1 serves as the introduction to the entire book, introducing Daniel and his friends and narrating how they come to be in Babylon and their circumstances. The narrative begins by describing the circumstances which lead to Daniel being exiled in Babylon. And we read in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. We're told that in the third year of the reign of the Judean king Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, besieges Jerusalem. We're next told that the Lord gave Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, along with vessels from the temple, and that Nebuchadnezzar brought these to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Notice that word Shinar. It really is an archaic reference to Babylon that is taken from Genesis 11, the story of the Tower of Babel, and is intended to conjure up the image of that story of the Tower of Babel. Really, the idea of humankind in rebellion against God, overreaching to bring God down by their man-made ziggurat to serve them by blessing them. This is an arrogant way in which the vessels from Yahweh's temple are being taken to Babylon. The vessels will feature again in the story of Daniel 5, in which Belteshazzar, a later Babylonian king, arrogantly presumes to drink from these vessels at a banquet. And they will later feature in the biblical story again in Ezra chapter 1, verse 7, 5, 13 and 15, and in Ezra 6, verse 1, in Cyrus the Great returning them to Jerusalem. Well, if we look, for instance, at Ezra chapter 5, we read there that in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, Cyrus the king made a decree that this house of God should be rebuilt. That is a reference to the temple. And the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple that was in Jerusalem and brought into the temple of Babylon, these Cyrus the king took out of the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered to one whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he made governor. And he said to him, "Take these vessels, go and put them in the temple that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt on its site." The idea is that despite Nebuchadnezzar's arrogant actions, Yahweh was the one who was in control, and that Yahweh could keep the vessels from his temple safe for decades, and when he was ready, return them to a rebuilt temple when he was ready for them to be used again. Well, in Daniel 1, the mention of the Judean king and the vessels from the house of God being given into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, and he's taken the vessels to put in the house of his God, would have conveyed some of the confusion, disorientation, and despair that the Judeans would have experienced as a result of these events. You see, defeat by another nation was, in the thinking of the time, an indication that the victorious nation's God was greater or stronger than your God. This was the message that was conveyed by the vessels being brought from the temple or the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem into the house of Nebuchadnezzar's God in Babylon. Now, we don't know for sure which God is being referred to as Nebuchadnezzar's God. It could be Nebu or Nabu, that is his patron god after which he had been named, or it could be Marduk, who is the supreme god of the Babylonian pantheon, who's also referred to as Bel, which was the Akkadian for Lord or Master, the idea being that Marduk was supreme over all the gods. But the idea to bring back trophies of victory over the Israelite God and to place them in the temple of the Babylonian God was to convey the idea that the God of the Israelites had been defeated or made a vassal of the Babylonian God. This is similar to when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant and put it in the temple of Dagon in 1 Samuel chapter 5. It was a practice of war for the victors to take the cult statue of the defeated nation's God and to bring that into the temple of the victorious God. In fact, as the IVP Bible Background Commentary points out, there are several examples of, in the ancient world, statues of a god being carried off as trophies of war. And in fact, the statue of Marduk was taken from Babylon and carried by different enemies of the Babylonians in the 17th century BC, in the 13th century BC, and more recently by their enemies, the Assyrians, as recent as the 7th century BC. And in each case, it was eventually recovered and restored to the temple of Marduk. Further, as the authors point out, in the 8th and 7th centuries, this was a common practice of the Assyrians, and as they observe, Isaiah prophesies that captivity would be the fate of the gods of Babylon, and he, in fact, references Isaiah 46, 1-2. And if we take a look at those verses, they can give us a little bit more of context for this practice. We read there, Isaiah writes, Bel, that is Lord, that is the Babylonian god Marduk, bows down. Nebu, that's a god that Nebuchadnezzar was named after, another Babylonian god in their pantheon, stoops low. Their idols, that is their cult statues, are borne by beasts of burden. The images that are carried about are burdensome. That is the statues of the idols. A burden for the weary. They stoop and bow down together. Unable to rescue the burden, they themselves go off into captivity. And the idea here being portrayed by Isaiah is that these cult statues are useless. They really are only a burden. They burden the beasts of prey, and they cannot help to lift the burden that they impose. And in fact, they will go off into captivity along with the rest of the Babylonians as they're being carried off into exile. Now, the basic idea is that the victors would take the cult statue of the defeated nation's god and bring it into the temple of the victor's god. But there was no cult statue in Yahweh's temple because the second commandment forbade the making of idols to worship Yahweh. And so Nebuchadnezzar takes instead the temple vessels used to serve Yahweh. This was essentially a power move. Power was being demonstrated over the deity by taking those things which were most significant to him. And perhaps you're asking, well, why didn't they just take the Ark of the Covenant? And that's because some suggest that by this time the Ark of the Covenant no longer existed based on Jeremiah 3:16. You can have a look at that passage. In any event, the taking of the temple vessels to Babylon was a sign of the victory of Nebuchadnezzar and his God over the Israelite king and his God. This would have raised questions for the Israelites in terms of their faith. Has our God been defeated? They'd have asked whether their faith in Yahweh had been misplaced, whether Israel's God Yahweh was weaker than the gods of the other nations, given the defeat of Judah by Babylon. They would have been asking, as we tend to ask in times of crisis and in times of tragedy, where is God and what is he doing? The writer of the book of Daniel answers a question of how the gods of the Jews could allow this to happen and whether he'd been defeated, but he answers by interpreting these events differently than how they would have been interpreted by the surrounding culture. That is, that Israel's God had been defeated by Babylon's God. And so what we read in Daniel chapter 1, verse 2, is that the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Daniel 1:2 offers the Israelites God's perspective amid their challenging and confusing circumstances. And what it says is that Yahweh was not defeated by Nebuchadnezzar's God. Nebuchadnezzar didn't defeat Jehoiakim. In fact, the Lord gave Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, along with the vessels from the temple that Nebuchadnezzar was taking to demonstrate that he had defeated Israel's God. The choice of words here used to refer to Israel's God is significant. And that word, if you notice in the text, it says, and the Lord. That's what it says, and the Lord. no caps, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Well, when you compare that, for instance, with a prophecy of Jeremiah in Jeremiah 20 and verse 4, we read, "For thus says the Lord," and notice all caps, "I will give all Judah into the hand of the king of Babylon. He shall carry them captive to Babylon, and shall strike them down with the sword. Moreover, I will give all the wealth of the city, all its grain, all its prize belongings, and all the treasures of the kings of Judah into the hand of their enemies, who shall plunder them, and seize them, and carry them to Babylon." So this is a parallel passage, but notice that what Jeremiah uses, the word that he uses, is different. Well, we can see it in our English text on the basis that we have the Lord capitalized. And the Lord capitalized in English Bibles is a convention that is used to refer to Israel's God's covenant name, Yahweh, Yod, He, Vav, He, YHWH in our English letters. And so that's a different word than what we read in Daniel 1:1, because in Daniel 1:1 we have the Lord lowercase, and that word, the Lord, in Daniel 1:2, actually, forgive me, is actually the word Adonai, which means Lord, Master, Owner, Ruler, or Sovereign. That's not the word Yahweh as we would have encountered in Jeremiah. Well, usefully, Stephen Miller in his commentary explains the significance of that specific usage of the word Adonai instead of Yahweh in Daniel 1:2, and we can just have a look at what he has to say. That Daniel's God was not asleep, but in full command of the situation is indicated by the name for deity selected by the author. In verse 2, the word translated Lord is not Yahweh, represented in the NIV by Lord in caps, but Adonai, and this is significant. Owner, ruler, or sovereign is the meaning of Adonai. By the use of this expression, Daniel was emphasizing the sovereignty of Yahweh, which is the dominant theme of the book. I think that's very clear. Essentially, what he's saying is that the choice of word emphasizes that Yahweh was sovereign or Lord over even Nebuchadnezzar. Yahweh was Lord, not Nebuchadnezzar, and not even Nebuchadnezzar's god, Marduk, whose name Bel meant Lord. Nebuchadnezzar was really Yahweh's underlord or vice-regent. He was not king over Judah, Yahweh was, and Yahweh was sovereign, and Nebuchadnezzar was really his vassal. God was sovereign, not Nebuchadnezzar. Now, in the ancient Near Eastern theology, the gods were local powers. And by that I mean, they would think that, for example, Yahweh was God over Israel, over the land of Israel, and he would have become subject to Babylon's gods if the land of Israel was conquered by the Babylonians. Daniel teaches Yahweh's people that Yahweh is not a local God over Israel or Canaan, but a God who's sovereign over all the nations. And in Daniel, the vision of the Jewish people is being expanded from Yahweh as the God over Israel to Yahweh as the God over all the nations. Now they've moved from Israel into the sphere of the wider international scene. In case their God was, as the saying goes, too small, God expands their vision to see that even though they have been defeated by the international powers, he's God over all nations and over all history. The message of Daniel confronts this lie, this idea that God was only the God of the land of Canaan and not the international powers, by telling us that God is sovereign over all the nations. And so we need not fear, we should not compromise. Things are not as they may seem. Even in our challenges, it is Yahweh who is in control. So, one of the ways in which the book of Daniel does this is by its repetition of a particular word 3 times in the text. And that word is Natan, which means give. Daniel conveys the truth about God's sovereignty by the use of this Hebrew word Natan, which means to give, and it's actually repeated, as I just said, 3 times in Daniel 1. Now, in Hebrew narrative, repetition, especially of words, is used for emphasis and to lead us to reflect on what the text is saying to us by comparing the repeated instances of the word. We will see that the Lord gave is repeated 3 times in Daniel as a means of conveying that Yahweh is sovereign over all things and so is to be trusted. On each occasion, a form of the Hebrew verb Natan is used, and that word, as I said, means to give. So if we look at the actual uses, we can see how this works out. First in Daniel 1:2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And then in verse 9, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And then finally in verse 17, as for these youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. The point of all these verses is that God is sovereign. Well, you say, well, how does God's giving something signify his sovereignty? The point of Daniel 1 is that God is the ultimate giver. And by that I mean all giving ultimately derives from God. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4 verse 7, what do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not? All we have from which to give or to do ultimately comes from what God gives to us. And so it's not that Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem or the vessels from the temple or that he defeated Jehoiakim. It is that God gave these into his hand. He could only do what God allowed him to do. And we'll see that God's sovereignty is also displayed in God's giving of favor and compassion and of wisdom to Daniel and his friends. Notice that God's sovereignty is displayed in something as simple as what he gives, and that this giving encompasses great things such as handing over kings and kingdoms to victors like Nebuchadnezzar, and in seemingly small things such as giving favor and compassion in the sight of officials, and in imperceptible but profound things as in giving learning and skill and wisdom and understanding, visions and dreams to those that he chooses. You see, God is sovereign over all things, great and small, and he rules them all simply by giving what he chooses to whom he wills. In our next video, we're going to study together Daniel 1 verses 3 to 7. I hope that you will join us then.